Welcome to this live question and answer session, which the Young Trustees movement has been putting on now for the last few weeks. So if you're new this evening, then welcome, big warm welcome to you. If you, after this, want to have some trustee homework, then feel free to look at the YouTube channel for the Young Trustees movement, because there's loads on there with all the content that we've covered in the past. And for those of you that are new, I thought it would be useful to just say in 2 lines what a trustee is, so that you can still get something out of this session if you've come to this trying to work out what trusteeship is. So it's really hard to say what trusteeship is in 2 sentences, but I'm going to give it my best shot, and you can come next week to these webinars and correct me should you have anything better in a 2-line summary. But essentially, a trustee holds the strategic, finance and legal responsibilities and accountabilities of a charity to the Charity Commission. Now, essentially, you are there to put your head in, but not your hands in, to decision making that organisations make. So you're really there to stretch the thinking of what organisations are doing when trying to fulfil their charitable objectives. We did a whole seminar, I think in the first week, around what is trusteeship. So there's a 45-minute webinar out there for you, as I say, to go and have a look at as part of your trustee homework. Now, today's session is titled How to Know if a Trusteeship is Right for You. And this is because there are times in your life when trusteeship isn't right for you, but there are also times when a very particular trusteeship isn't right for you. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by one of our ambassadors, Anthony Wheeler, to talk about his experience around working out whether a trusteeship was right for him at the time that he took the decision to join a board. So Anthony, do you want to introduce yourself as a starter?
Yeah, thank you very much, Leon. Hi, everyone. So my name is Anthony. I am 25 and I'm a young trustee. I've been a trustee since I was 20 and I've been a trustee twice in 2 different capacities, but for the same charity. So my kind of big question of why trusteeship has changed kind of over the last 5 years. And I'm kind of looking forward to delving into that for everybody here. I'm currently the chair of trustees of a charity called Cambridge Student Community Action, and have been chair for the last month. So it's been a huge learning curve for me over the last month to kind of get to grips with chairship and everything that's entailed with that, on top of being a trustee. And I'm also the Young Trustees Movement Ambassador for the East of England. So if any of you are watching are from the East of England and haven't had a chat with me, type something out in the chat and I'd love to connect with you all.
Yes, and that's a great reminder, actually. If you have any questions, we will thread you into the session. Just type in the box that you have a question, or if you would like me to read out your question for you, just private message me in the chat function, and I will do that. So let's kick off then. So why trusteeship? Why at 25, the grand old age of 25, and actually you joined your board before then, why did you decide trusteeship is the right thing for me?
So this is an interesting question, because when I first became a trustee, I didn't even ask myself that question, which I think is a really important question to ask. I accidentally became a trustee when I was 20. The charity that I was a trustee of is a student-led charity. So it's both a student society and a registered charity. And because of that, the youth voice is really kind of at the center of what we do. The charity has a student steering group who kind of are a day-to-day advisory body. And they're an elected board of student members. But the president, vice president, and treasurer of that committee also sit as full trustees for the year that they hold that role on the steering group. So their voice is really firmly at the center of what the charity does. I, in my final year of university, was the student president of that charity, and then became a trustee alongside that as well. So kind of turned up to my first board meeting and they were kind of like, here's your induction, you're also a trustee. And I was kind of like, I have no idea what that is, but thank you. And I will learn what that is going through. I then had a really wonderful year learning what a trustee is, everything that comes with it, and kind of really found my voice on a charity board. I then left, having done that as a year, thinking actually, trusteeship is something that I'd like to revisit in the future, but not right at that moment. And at that moment, it was quite pertinent because someone on the trustee board reached out to me then and said, Anthony, we're recruiting for new trustees at the moment, and we'd really like it if you would come back and apply. And I had just graduated, I just turned 22, I just started a job in marketing, and I said, no, I'm really sorry, I don't have any skills to offer you, I'm not going to apply, thank you very much. And they were kind of like, okay, you do you, that's totally fine. And they went away. And then a few months later, they got back in touch and said, I'd really like you to reconsider, like, we're still recruiting. We think you'd be great on the board. And at that point, I really asked myself the question, okay, is this right for me at this point in my life? And my thoughts were, actually, the board already has 3 young people every single year on the board. What do I add of any difference? Am I actually kind of oversaturating the board with youth, or am I just coming in and is it too much of a learning experience for me to do anything at that moment? So again, I said no, said, thank you very much again. Very kind of you to reach out, but not for me. Then the third time, they convinced me to go for coffee with them. We sat down, we were talking, and they kind of, it wasn't that they wouldn't take no for an answer, but they sat down and kind of really convinced me that not only should I consider it, but I should at least come along to watch a meeting, to observe a meeting, which I think if any of you are out there thinking about trusteeship, observing a meeting is a really, really good starting point for gauging how a charity works, but also how a boardroom works. So I went along to a meeting, we were sat there with the agenda and we started going through points. And almost immediately, I was sat there thinking, right, well, I have an opinion on point A and I have something I want to say about point C and there's something else that I want to come in here. And I immediately left the meeting going, trusteeship is right for me. It was kind of almost like a switch had kind of clicked. And I knew that that was the right thing for me to do at that moment. And then 3 years later, kind of chairship came up. And I also knew that that was the right thing for me at this period of my life.
Great, thanks for that. And there's a little nugget in there, which we have spoken about in some of the other sessions around being younger and earlier on in your career. Sometimes you feel like you have to say yes to every opportunity that's presented in front of you. What was your thought process to being able to say no, not once, but 3 times? Were you worried that no opportunities would come up in the future, or did you just think it was the right thing to do for you and the charity at the time?
I think it was a mix of all of those things, Leon, but I also think it was me underestimating myself in some way. I think I'd kind of started out and I said, okay, I'm starting out in the real world, and I'd almost kind of gone from being involved in so many things at university and, being an ambassador for a certain movement or being kind of a president of a steering group of a charity. And then I went into the real world and was very much at the bottom of everything. And I was kind of like, actually, maybe that's the only thing I should be focusing on at this point in my life. And I really kind of felt the people that are on the trustee board, they're there to offer professional advice, they're there to offer networks, they're there to offer so much more than what I could give being 22 at that period of my life. I was very wrong. I had so much more to kind of give and offer at that period. But for me, it was really about taking a step back. And I'm kind of a mind mapping person. I like to mind map things out. So it was really kind of sitting down and kind of writing out on paper, right, this is what I've got going on in my life right now. I have kind of my job, and this is kind of the professional development I want to do in my job. This is what I've got going on socially. And for the first time ever, I had money and could enjoy myself. This is what I wanted to kind of, segment off that time of my life. But also, do I have time for something else? And actually, by the time I got to the 3 rounds of saying no, at that point, I was like, I definitely do have time in my kind of schedule to fit this in, but also the kind of mental headspace to really give myself to the charity.
I think there's something there for everyone that's watching, which is that if at that particular time in your life, the trusteeship is not the right way for you to give your time to a charity, and there are plenty of other ways that you can volunteer for a charity. But if we just turn that on its head a little bit, I'm only 3 years older than you, but I remember throughout my 20s having a pretty hectic and busy life. How have you balanced, or how do you balance the demand the board places on your time with everything else going on?
It's a very interesting question. And I'm sure that I have a few friends watching this, and I'm sure they'll tell you that sometimes I do kind of reach the capacity of what I'm doing. But I'd like to think that I'm quite self-aware of that capacity. And in signing up to the board, it was very explicit that our meetings are at X time throughout the year. This is kind of the number of preparation that you'll have. And anything extra on top of that, like we have subcommittees, we have extra things happening, that's very much kind of based on your time and how much you're willing to give. And for me, the things that I'm taking on in my life, I try and always make sure that there's some degree of flexibility in them. There's a base layer of the pyramid that's kind of like, we have 6 board meetings a year and we have an annual general meeting that we have to go to. But actually the rest of it on there is as much as I can and I'm willing to give at any period through the year. And for me, that was kind of a value that I was really kind of seeking out in any opportunity that I was going for, professionally and kind of trusteeship professionally and in the rest of my life. And it's really kind of about thinking about those values for yourself and how you can map that onto the things that you're doing in your 20s. And for me, I found that a really kind of an anchor point for me in kind of guiding my 20s at the moment.
Do you get volunteering leave in your day job as well to give you some time to do your trusteeship? Or how do you, so like on a very practical level, how do you, if not, how do you find the time to do it?
So I don't get volunteering leave through my job. However, I do have a head of department who is very flexible in how I manage my hours. Right. And he very much believes in the fact that I'm doing a trusteeship and I'm volunteering my time in a certain way. So, you know, sometimes I will have meetings over lunch that will overrun and she doesn't mind because I will work slightly later. I might have, actually for the Young Trustees movement, when there were workshops in London, it was fine for me to have that afternoon and redistribute my hours so I could come to London to do that workshop. I'm very, very fortunate that I have a head of department who allows me to do that. And I know some people can't. But as I kind of said earlier, I knew that for me, flexibility was a really key thing in my life at that period and still is in my life in this period. So finding a kind of a professional job with my trusteeship that I could manage and balance works really well. And actually our board meetings are after hours in any case. They're always at 5:45 on a Tuesday every kind of 8 weeks during normal term times.
And that's what I was about to ask next, because there is something around that what coronavirus has done is probably shifted people's conversations quite quickly around working life and the fact that you don't need to be sat in front of a computer in some grim office somewhere for 37.5 hours a week to get your job done. So for those of you that are starting your trustee journey, you are entering at a time when everyone is thinking about work differently and also using things like Zoom to hold their board meetings. And if you are somebody who is worried about balancing your day job with your volunteering, one thing I saw when Bernardo's were recruiting young trustees a while back is the chair offered to write to the new young trustees employer to say, this is what trusteeship does, this is how it benefits, can you support that person in being able to fulfill that role? And I thought that was a really brazen, bold step for a chair to take. But of course it's got the branding of Bernardo's behind it, which is great because it's a massive national charity. But if you are for a local food bank in the community that you live in, that might not have the same weighting. But one thing I wanted to ask is, with your organisation, you obviously have student trustees. Do you think it makes a difference having other young people in the room as well?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's interesting thinking about how that translates into your board culture. And I actually think it's very much more about the culture of your board than who's necessarily sat in the room there. Often the people sat in the room are a reflection of the board culture or are creating the board culture. They're kind of so intertwined. But actually, because we have 3 young people every single year on our board, it means that our board culture has to be inclusive and accepting, because there is that yearly changeover. There has to be this appreciation that we always need to be learning and thinking about how we can include new people in the board every single year, but also making it so that the year that those student trustees are on the board isn't just tokenistic. It's actually really meaningful, and that they have as many opportunities as possible to use their voice in that way. And actually that works in reverse, because it means that newer trustees that we've had who aren't young, they have come into that culture, and it's so open and accepting for them to be able to come in and say, I'm a first-time trustee at 45. I also have a lot to learn, but this board culture that we've created, and I think by including young people or by including other diverse people and other voices and kind of having a diversity of opinion in a boardroom, that's actually what's really, really important. And, we have that nice diagram that we kind of share on our social media that has kind of age, sexual orientation, race, etc. It's having a board culture that allows those things to naturally happen and to thrive when they're in those circumstances. So yes, having young people really has allowed us to build our entire culture as an organisation to be inclusive and diverse.
And what about your sort of individual experience? If you were joining a different organisation that wasn't a youth charity or an organisation that works with young people and students, do you think having another young trustee around the table would have been helpful to you if you were joining that sort of board?
100%. I think it's that classic thing of seeing somebody else that is like you, seeing somebody else there that represents what it is that you can kind of like having a mirror there, is kind of saying there's another young person there that can potentially mentor me. They might have been on the board 2 years longer than you have. Can they come in and offer you some advice in some way? And I think I would have found that really, really useful if I went into a charity. I actually had a call last week with someone who is on the board of a charity, and she is the only woman on the board, and she's the only person under the age of 69. And it's a board of 13, I think. And it's really interesting because she's really taken it in her stride, and she's kind of, slowly changing the culture within her own board. But I definitely know that if I was 22, 23 again, and I went to a board where everybody on the board was so different to me, I would have found that a really intimidating experience. And I would have so appreciated having somebody else there that can be that person to kind of be like, this is okay, this is what's expected of you, this is some advice that we can have. And actually, I feel really, really fortunate that I'm now in that position in our charity, so that every year I take on a mentorship role for the student president who comes onto the committee. And it's actually been really, really nice to kind of have that reverse role flipped, and acknowledging that we as young people who are trustees now kind of have that power, I guess, to influence and change that board culture from within.
And that's really important about getting mentorship when you join a board, but also offering yourself as a mentor to other people that come through the process. And for some of you who are watching, you very well might be the first young person appointed to the board of whichever charity it is that you end up going for. And when I was appointed to the plan board way back when, about 10 years ago now, I was the only young person in the room. I was the poorest person in the room by a long stretch. I was one of the minority that didn't have any knighthoods or ennoblements and all the rest of it. And there is something about, I think my appointment for the first couple of years was certainly the guinea pig years, where they were working out, the charity felt like it needed to have young people in the room, and therefore tokenistically probably appointed a young trustee, but actually pretty quickly started to realize the value of having diverse perspectives and skills. So there's something there for those of you that are like, actually, I don't want to join an organization that hasn't already done some of this thinking, then fine. But also, if you are confident enough to go and be the guinea pig, it's worth doing, because actually whatever the culture is that you inherit when you move into the board, you will be a big person that makes sort of earthquake level movements and changes to the culture in a board. And also the movement now exists, so you can get mentorship from your ambassador or from other people in the movement who are building up their experience as a trustee. So there's just a sort of flag of confidence there for those of you that are thinking, I want to apply for charity X, they don't have any young trustees at the moment, but I also want to sort of take on the battle really of making sure that I change the hearts and minds around young trustees. Now, you spoke earlier a little bit about board observations, and I think observing a board is a critical part of the recruitment process, or at least should be, and you should request it. What advice would you give to someone who has observed a board but feels like the culture isn't quite right to help them thrive? Because you don't want to just join a board and, survive. You do want to be contributing to other things. So what advice would you give to help people square that circle, or circle the square, whatever the saying is?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because you can approach it from kind of two perspectives. And you touched on this slightly just before, in that it really depends on kind of you as a person and your values. Actually knowing yourself really well, or kind of doing an exercise to figure out kind of, your skill set and kind of your mindset. Do you need that board culture to be different for you to join it? Or are you happy to lead that change? And they're two quite different things. If you're able to kind of join that board and say, right, I can already see from observing this meeting that, there isn't that inclusivity that I would like there to be for me to be able to thrive. But I know that I can work hard for the next 2-3 years of my appointment to lead that change and make sure that's different for somebody else. And touching on what you said about the movement is really, really important now, because actually you might be the young person on that board, but you now have the network and support of hundreds of other young trustees that you can reach out to and say, have you been through a similar experience? If you say, I'm on a really small charity board, or I'm on a really large charity board, how did you go about having those conversations? Who should I be kind of targeting? Is it the chair? Is it the CEO? How do I get that sort of buy-in? If you're that sort of person with that drive, 100% go for it. kind of scope it out, know that that's right for you. But actually, you might not be that person, and that's totally fine. That's why there are 700,000 trusteeships in the UK, and actually maybe that charity right then isn't for you. And kind of the point of this webinar is it's okay to say no to things. You might, really believe in what this charity stands for, but you go to that meeting and you go there and you just have that feeling, actually this isn't right for me right now, and that's fine. And it's important to listen to that. And maybe it might be that you just need to take some time away and say, could I come to another board meeting? Could I take a few months to think about it? Or you might say right there and then, actually no, but what I've learned is what is important for me in a board culture, and I know what questions to ask when I apply for a trustee role next. But also sorry, Leon.
If there are some, I was just going to ask, you can come back to your answer and maybe thread an answer into this bit, but I was going to ask, if there's someone watching this who isn't a huge mover and shaker and sort of just wants to join a board and offer their experience and expertise on the bits that they want to offer, but actually doesn't want to have those big battles around culture, and some of those kind of more broader things to do with making a board thrive, are there any tips you have for those sorts of people who could get involved in other, who could show their expertise in other ways and change culture more gradually?
Definitely. And I think that's a very good point, because I think quite a lot of people fall into that bracket. And often with board culture, lots of the reasons things are there are because it's structural. Something is in place that stops it being inclusive in lots of ways. And actually, could you on the board get involved in a process or a way to change a structure? Something like board recruitment. If you're on the panel for recruiting new trustees, you might be there asking the questions to say, we're holding all of our interviews at 2:00 on a Thursday afternoon. What about the people that can't get time off on a Tuesday afternoon to apply for a voluntary position? Or, from lots of ways, you might have so many thoughts in that process, just to challenge the kind of status quo of what's happening there, and kind of slowly have that conversation to have that there. And I think that's a really important thing to look at. Are there subcommittees you could join to start asking those questions around changing that board culture? And the small parts then become a snowball effect. And actually, the small questions that you might ask, another trustee might pick up on that and also start asking similar questions. And that's kind of the value that I really kind of see in that. For if you don't want to go in kind of guns blazing, being like, we need to change everything, this is how you be more inclusive, to actually say, right, this is for the next 3 years, I would love to change these small things, but know that the impact of those small things are actually really quite big.
I think subcommittees is a really useful thing to bring up as well, because I think subcommittees are really good ways to learn about things as a trustee as well. If your board is doing something around, I don't know, digital engagement, for instance, and digital just isn't really your thing, actually joining a subcommittee to be a learner and a sort of litmus test voice around whatever it is your organisation wants to do can be a really good thing. And because you're working with fewer trustees in a more intimate setting, you can start to win over your champions within that board. So if any of you do join a trustee board or are already on one or in your early stages of one, definitely recommend from the two of us getting involved in a subcommittee should you have the opportunity to do so. Now, one thing that we haven't quite covered is some of the wraparound stuff that you can do to check if a trusteeship is right for you. What sort of due diligence do you think an aspiring trustee should do as they go through a recruitment process?
Yeah, so there's a kind of few fundamental things that I'd really recommend if you're thinking about a trusteeship. The first one is just research. Looking on their website, what can you discover? What can you find there? Is there information about the board? Are there information about the projects that they're running? Is there, their website's a really good source of information, or any publications that they've done if they're bigger charities on what they're doing. But interestingly, an important angle to take is, what can you not find? What does their website not say? What do their publications not say? And are they questions that you can then ask the charity to kind of, one, show that you're interested, but two, find out the things that you really, really want to know. So that's kind of the kind of basis that I'd say there. The next, I'd say, try if you can to read the last year's annual reports. You might get some really, really good insight into how the charity works, the way that their management structure is, what their staff are working on, what their strategic priorities are. It might kind of lead into a strategic plan or a business plan that they're working through. That's a really good insight for you to say, kind of, this is where the charity is, and this is where the charity hopes to be going in the next few years. That gives you a really good insight. And the key one is also the finances. And people often shy away from finances, particularly to do with charities. But we'd really recommend looking through their accounts. Some charities have them on their website, some have them in their annual reports, but if not, you can always access them through the Charity Commission website. And it's really important for you to do that, one, so you can see how they're doing financially, but two, so that you can ask the right questions, because one of your responsibilities as a trustee is kind of guardianship of those finances, and it's an important responsibility as a trustee. One thing I'd also say, and people do this often in job searches, but not necessarily with trusteeship, is could you use something like LinkedIn to reach out to some of the other trustees on the board to assess how that board culture is, or assess what's happening, and have that informal chat. Often in trustee recruitment, they might say, here's the kind of contact details of the chair, here's the contact details of the CEO, and you might feel actually that's a bit formal, they might be involved in your recruitment process. But on the trustee board, you're going to be peers and equals with those other trustees there. And it's important for you to figure out how those relationships work and what advice they could give you in the process there as well.
I think that they're all excellent tips. And what I'm going to do now is to share my screen to put into practice one of the things that you said around accessing accounts. So for those of you that are watching, if you've never done this before, I recommend doing it, especially if you're just a bit of a geek when it comes to the charity sector. Essentially, you can go onto the Charity Commission's website, which looks a little bit like this, and using their Find a Charity tab, you can type in any charity name or number to identify the organisation that you're in discussions with about joining their board, or who you're just doing some research on. Most charities have their charity number on their website, so you can just copy and paste it in and it will pull up the record, or search it by name. Just be careful though, if you're searching an organisation that has lots of branches like the Scouts, that you are making sure you're looking at the correct branch of the Scouts. It can get a bit complicated if you are, like I say, in a federated organisation. But just from typing in the organisation where I'm deputy chair, just for, well, why not? It makes sense, and I know these numbers, so I can talk through them. You can see a couple of things. One is the registered activities that your charity says to the Charity Commission that it does. This is a good place to start because it means that you can check what your organisation has been set up to do. And as a trustee, making sure that your charity does that and doesn't breach what it's supposed to do is one of the critical roles. Now, of course, as your organisation matures and develops and changes and the context in which it operates change, you might want to change the charitable objectives that you are set up for. But as an initial starting place, this is a good place to look. You also get a breakdown of income and expenditure here. You get to see the number of employees and volunteers at the bottom, so you get a real flavour for size. And the reality is most organisations in the UK charity sector turn over less than £100,000. I think it's about 74%, it might even be higher than that actually, turn over less than £100,000. But you'll find, yeah, green on time, and that if you raise a flag for sort of regulatory framework that the Charity Commission sets for them. Now, you can delve into the account a bit more and have a look at different elements to the history of the charity. So I'll try and load financial history now. But if not, a useful tab is this one here, Contacts and Trustees. Every trustee that is a registered ready for your LinkedIn searches. And as I say here, look, you can see when our accounts were received and when the annual return was received, we're always on time. The compliance is pretty good. You can see that over the last few years, our income has dropped and our spending has dropped. So, and you can download accounts here too. So you actually get a pretty decent overview of your charity. As Anthony said, if you can get your head around numbers, you will be a really powerful trustee. You don't don't have to be an accountant to be able to understand accounts. There are some very basic training videos out on YouTube which will help you navigate it. But for most organizations, it's money in, money out, and what's left over. That's largely the discipline for it. Just to show you the contact trustees bit, so here you go, there's my name there. I'm not a trustee of any other charity. You can search others and find them. So should you, if they have a generic name like Chris Martin, not Chris Martin of Coldplay, I can assure you, I think, is his name Chris Martin? I'm sure it is anyway. You can use LinkedIn to narrow your search down. So I wanted to show you that to give you a practical example of how that might work in practice. And I've got a question that's coming from Dan Law. So I'm just reading it. Oh, your Wi-Fi is dodgy. All right, Dan, I'll ask it for you as you've requested. Dan has asked, what are your views on applying for trustee positions whilst being in full-time education? Anthony?
Oh, I would say there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. There shouldn't be a barrier to you applying for trusteeships at all. The important question to ask, I would say, is what is the term of the trusteeship? Because depending on what you're doing in full-time education, your situation in 1, 2, 3 years' time might be different. So actually, something like what I did, I volunteered for the charity first for 2, 3 years, and then took on a position that in my final year at uni was a year-long position, so that when I graduated, it would end, because I knew that when I graduated, I didn't know where I was going to go. And actually, it would not have been in the best interest of the charity for me to have signed up for a 3-year role, done it for a year, and then left and gone. Because 1, I would have just felt bad about that. 2, it might have put the charity off recruiting young people in the future. It might have helped them build up some sort of bias against young people, which is not what we really want to do. So yes, I would say look around, see what's out there, and kind of just assess where you are at that point. Is there a leadership program you can take part in? But also, trusteeship isn't the be all and end all. Maybe actually you say, right now during full-time education, a trusteeship is not right for me for X, Y, Z, but volunteering is right for me. There is something else that I could do on there. Could you sit on a steering group of a charity and not have those legal responsibilities, but still be involved in a charity in that way? But know that your ultimate goal is, actually, when I leave full-time education, trusteeship's what I'm going to be aiming for then. And what can I do between now and then to build up my skills as a trustee? Could I take part in the movement more? Could I go along to some more webinars to learn things? Could I get my head around finances better? So that when you are applying for trusteeship, you've kind of already got a bit of a leg up on doing that. But I would say generally, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it as long as it's right for you and it's also right for the charity at that point. Be super open with the charity as well. It's also fine for you to talk to the charity and say, this is my situation. I'm in uni full time. I can totally come to the meetings in these months, but actually May, June, July, I have exams and I'm going to be a little bit off the radar. Is that okay? Do you have really important meetings then? They might say our AGM is then, and actually we really need all of our trustees on board in those months. But like my charity, our AGM is in March before all of the exams hit for that exact reason. So, you know, thinking about how the charities fit in with you, it's nice to find that kind of perfect match. That's what I'd advise.
And I think that goes full circle with your advice earlier about mapping it out and mapping out your first year or two as a trustee of the organisation you're talking to. Dan, the other thing that I would say is it's always worth asking whether they can change the time requirements. That requires a certain level of confidence for sure, but often trustee boards meet way more than they actually have to. And no trustee has ever challenged that. So sometimes it can be, you meet, I don't know, 10 times a year. Do you really need to meet that much? And ask that question. I would say as well, if you're a full-time student and you are looking to leave the city of study in the next year or 18 months, I think be up and open, upfront about that so that the charity can decide whether or not it's appropriate for you to join the board at that time. And even if you do join the board at that time, that they have in the back of their minds the fact that you'll be leaving because you might move city after your studies. If, of course, you intend to stick around, then that's a moot point. But I do come across chairs fairly often who get frustrated at student trustees who joined midway through their second year and then leave basically a year later because they're no longer living in their city of study. So that's another thing just to think about with time. Ellen has just commented. Ellen, do you want to ask your question? Shall I can unmute you. Let's try this. Ellen, go ahead.
So I was wondering, you kind of made the example of a job search and you compared certain elements to looking for a job. I was wondering if there's any other ways in which looking for a trusteeship is similar or different to that process as something most of us might be familiar with.
Yeah. Anthony, do you want to answer first?
Yeah, I think this is slightly a cop-out answer, but I will go into it a bit more. But last week we covered that. We have an entire webinar you can find on YouTube that's 45 minutes, exactly like this, that covers how to find trusteeships and what to look out for when you're doing it. But I think that the kind of job search parallel is quite useful. You know, if a charity is asking you to prepare a CV, for example, it's worth tailoring that CV to kind of a skill set that they're looking for. What do you need to put into a cover letter, for example? Stuff like that, you could get really good advice for on the hub. I'd really recommend kind of putting out a question on there and getting advice from lots of other people to put that in there. But I mean, there's also ways in which that trusteeship is advertised. We discussed some last week, such as Reach Volunteering, getting on board are really good places to look for it. The important thing, however, is that at the moment, lots of trusteeship is found through word of mouth and through networks. Best practice in the charity sector is not to do that, is to have a proper recruitment process, and people are working to kind of change that and make it kind of more streamlined. So some charities you'll apply for will kind of have you submit a type of application, you might have an informal meeting with the chair or CEO, and then you might have an interview with the board. But other charities, it might be a bit more informal, or you might be reached out to come for a trusteeship. So it's worth just acknowledging that actually there are several different routes into trusteeship, and the kind of job search parallel is good. And that's kind of a direction that I feel like, and Leon, correct me if I'm wrong, but the charity sector is kind of moving in that direction, or we would like it to move in that direction. But currently there are lots and lots of different ways and routes into trusteeship, and it's just worth being aware of those.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just flagging, and we did cover this last week, as you rightly point out, but every organisation is different. You know, lots of the more established charities will do their trustee recruitment diligently and with a bit more process behind it. But there are lots of organisations out there that people just set up because they want to do something nice in their local area, and they're not interested in using job boards or whatever. So you do find things out through word of mouth locally. And someone else, I think it was Meg, added into the Young Trustees Hub the other day, and I put it down too, about the NSPCC Young Trustee role. They're looking for someone between the ages of 18 to 25, and I've just pulled up their advert now, and they're saying if you want an informal and confidential discussion, you can contact their head of governance. Now, they are very lucky to have a head of governance. Most organisations, even big charities, don't necessarily have that role. So that's an example where that particular process is probably going to be quite watertight in terms of making sure that anyone and everyone can apply for it, and that it's put out on all the correct channels that it needs to be put out on. But I really recommend you having a look on the Young Trustees Hub, connecting with the ambassadors on there, but also on LinkedIn, because quite often I'm sharing stuff on LinkedIn and liking it, which will put it into your feed and all the rest of it. And I know the other ambassadors are too. So I think it's about, doing all the tools and methods you put into your normal day job search, use those for trusteeship. It's no different, really. Now, I wanted to just circle us back a little bit into how to know if trusteeship is right for you. And one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I think this does link to the last question actually, depending on where somebody is in their trustee journey, do you think that should dictate or act as a filter for the sorts of organisations they should be looking for?
Yes and no. I can't give a simple answer to this one. And I think it's a lot more about taking a step back and kind of really thinking about where you are at that period of your life. Once you have a really good handle on where you are and what you're looking for and what you can offer, you can then, I think, start making those decisions about whether or not a trusteeship is for you, or whether that certain trusteeship is for you. And actually, you might be able to identify, you know, I'm at this period of my life and I know that I would 100% love to work for X charity. And you might only want to apply for that charity, but if you apply for that charity, you might not want any of the trusteeships, or you might actually just say, I just want to be a trustee. You have to care about what the charity does and their values, but you might just think, you know, I just want to be able to give something back and do something. So it's thinking about those sorts of things and deciding whether or not you need to use the movement more, and asking about the timing as well. I think particularly because we are young and that's our focus, and we're very mobile at this period of our lives, particularly in the kind of first 5 to 7 years of kind of being 18 onwards. Thinking about the timings and can you commit to those requirements. Some charities, like you said, might have 10 meetings a year. We have 6 a year that are really structured around student terms. And it's thinking about those sorts of things and knowing that, that is important. But also it's okay to realize that right now a trusteeship might not be right for you. It's totally okay to say, I'd love to give something to the charity sector, but maybe right now volunteering is the best thing for you, or a bit of campaigning is the best thing for you. Or can you do something digitally to promote young trusteeship, but actually taking on a trusteeship right now just isn't the best thing for you to be doing. And that's not the end of the world. There are so many other things that you can do in the charity sector, and knowing that trusteeship could be something that you do in the future is something to really hold on to. Sorry.
Okay. I think whilst you quickly get some water, I will ramble for a second, which is bringing that back on itself. And I think we have covered this, but I do want us to hammer the point home, because I know that I certainly spent many of my early 20s in this position. But, if someone out there watching this is thinking, I really, really want to be a trustee because I'm coming to these webinars, it all sounds awesome and I really want to do it. Will any role do?
I would say if you really, really, really want to be a trustee, there are still some fundamental questions you can ask yourself about why you really, really, really want to be a trustee. And, it shouldn't be because you're just swept up in the excitement of that trusteeship sounds exciting. I think asking those questions of, do I want to be a trustee because I really strongly believe in accountability in the charity sector? Do I have a certain cause that I'm really passionate about? And finding out those sorts of questions, I think personally, and you might disagree, Leon, but I think it's not as simple as a, yes, I want to be a trustee, no, I want to be a trustee. I think if you do decide you want to be a trustee, within that, there's still a plethora of other questions to ask yourselves. And ultimately, you don't want to end up on a position where you just accept any trusteeship that comes your way because it's easy for you to get that trusteeship. Because then you might be on a board for 3 years, or you might step down from the board very quickly, which is not only kind of, bad for the charity, because they would really need a trustee at that period, but you don't want to be unhappy on a trustee board. We don't want you to join a trustee board because you just really want to be a trustee and you're sat there and unhappy or feeling frustrated, or you're in an environment that actually isn't inclusive and safe for you as a young person or as any person on that trustee board. So I think it's just important to ask yourself those questions. But if you really, really want to be a trustee, there will be a trusteeship out there for you. There are 700,000 in the UK. It might not be next week or next month, but if you keep looking and do the right searching, it will be there for you. And I think that's the advice that I would give for that one, Leon.
Yeah, I think I love all of that. I think that's great. And for those of you that are a step before that and are thinking, what kind of organisations do I want to be a trustee of? Then actually ask yourself that question and shortlist, according to your values and your interests, what are the 5 or 6 organisations that you would like to be a trustee for. You don't necessarily have to name the individual organisation, but what I'm getting at is 5 or 6 organisations and the type of work that they do. Because if you filter your search, you are probably more likely to have success than if you just go with all guns blazing trying to find any particular role. We've covered how to find trusteeships, as I said, in previous webinars. So if you want some of that homework, it is out there for you, and we cover all of this sort of stuff. I note, though, that finance skills keep coming up in these webinars. So maybe a future webinar should be a quick induction into charity finances, so you can learn how to navigate a set of accounts, at least giving you the basics to be able to do that. And once you've got the basics, the rest sort of falls in. Now, we are out of time. Are there any last thoughts you want to give, Anthony? Anything that you want to say that the questions I asked didn't give you the chance to say, just before I then plug what's happening next week?
No, I think the only thing that I would say is if anybody is watching this in the webinar right now or in future, I'm always available to be reached out to on the Digital Hub or on LinkedIn. Find me, ask me a question. I'd love to connect with anybody, particularly if you're in the east of England. I'd really like that.
Great, thank you very much. And next week's is Amy Dowling, who's one of our other ambassadors, who is going to be talking to me about how to develop your skills. Amy's the ambassador for Yorkshire and the Humber, so we're moving from the south up north a little bit towards my home region, which I'm delighted about. So do join us same time next week. This will be uploaded tomorrow in the morning, so you'll be able to go back and watch it and share with it and like it and do all the other things that you need to do. Please do tune in next week. You'll find more information on the Young Trustees Hub. If you're not already a member, become a member and connect with us on there, because we would love to be able to provide any guidance and support we can as you start or progress your trustee journeys. But that just leaves me to say thank you very much, Anthony, for spending the last 45 minutes with me. I hope everyone that's watching found that helpful, and have a very nice evening.